Solver, your book is part memoir and part a work of kind of political thought of your the development of your thought through this time. So I thought we might go in these sort of 10 or 15 minutes and take that kind of intellectual development of yours through your biography. So after a little stint in Princeton, you went over to work for Sir Keith Joseph, and then into Mrs. Thatcher's policy unit when you were right there in the slaying of the dragons, as you call it, in all these groups. But there's a bit in there where you talk about that kind of, you say there's a slight whiff of revolutionary zeal in the air, and you knew you were likely to be classed either as part of the revolution or part of the reaction. And the reaction wasn't just the socialists, but sort of the wets as well. I dare say there are a couple of people in this room who use the word sound that you've grown to sort of not like quite so much. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk about what that feeling was like in the 80s, of being sound, being the dries versus the wets, and what effect that has had on you since.
Yes, I'm horrified that you read the book so carefully. I can't imagine what else you may have discovered. I, of course, can now barely remember any of it. I've just finished writing another book, and in the meanwhile, this has disappeared from my mind entirely. But I do recall that I had some things to say about soundness. And I very much agree with what I said about soundness. So I mean, first of all, I think because Mrs. T was trying to create a sort of democratic revolution and break the mold of years of a particular kind of thinking that had got embedded in everything really, trade unions, industry, the professions, parliament, government, the civil service, and so on. She felt the need to surround herself to the extent she could with people who were of like mind, and there were, to begin with, very, very few. And therefore she wanted to distinguish them and us, and them was almost everybody, and us was a few, Praetorian Guard and herself. And I mean, this is entirely understandable, and of course it is the tradition of revolutions. Lenin's profound observation that few but good was the way to foster a revolution has always, I think, proved true. So it was an epiphenomenon of the history that was, I think, inevitable. I don't think there was anything that could have been done about that. You couldn't have done what she did without creating that sort of sense. But, and this is what I'm trying to bring out, it had a very bad effect in particular, and I think it always has, in general, a bad effect. The particular bad effect was the sensible things that people who were classed as wets were saying, and even some of the sensible things that some people who weren't classed as wets were saying, were classed as unsound and therefore weren't to be listened to. And of course, if you listen to everybody and you allow yourself to be captured by every passing thought, you never do anything, and she was determined to do things. But on the other hand, if you listen to nobody, other than those that already agree with you, then you don't discover whether they actually have sensible things to say that would modify what you want to do. And in this particular case, the point I'm trying to bring out is she didn't listen enough to Keith Joseph, and she didn't listen enough to Ian Gilmore and people like that, who from different positions, one dry, one wet, were trying to bring out the desperate need to yoke the changes she was making to the way in which they could be brought to bear on problems of poverty and social injustice. And that was just kind of swept out of the way because of this requirement for soundness. I think the general point is that, and this I've come to believe over the years more and more, and if I ever doubted it, the referendum campaign for the Brexit referendum persuaded me of it. When you adopt a position which tries to ignore the rationality of opposing positions, you end up with a weaker argument, I think. You end up with something which is less true to the facts and less likely to be balanced. The two campaigns over Brexit, I don't know which was the more ludicrous. Universal bliss to break out the day after we leave, or the end of the world is nigh. Clearly neither of these was true. There were all sorts of intelligent people who really should have known better. I don't think the public was particularly gulled by it. I don't think particularly it matters. I think most sensible people still made a much more balanced judgment than that. But this was driven, I think, by the sense we have to be sound one way or the other. And actually, I repeatedly have found over the years people adopting positions which they perfectly well know do not actually tally with their experience and the reality, because they fear being characterized as somehow weak or woolly or unsound. Feeble, exactly. Weak, feeble. And I think actually real strength of character and of intellect consists of being unwilling, in part, to be afraid of being characterized as weak. Real strength, you find it in Gandhi, you find it in Mandela, you find it in all sorts of people who were capable of absorbing things from outside, as well as maintaining a very, very strong position of their own. And actually, of course, the bizarre truth is that the one person who often did take on board, quote, unsound ideas and didn't get castigated for it was Mrs. Thatcher. And this was the sort of irony of the situation. On this particular question of social justice, she didn't enough take them on board. But quite often, she would take up a position which other people had been afraid of taking up because they were afraid of being castigated for being unsound. And lo and behold, it turned out that the very Fonzette Origo of soundness herself had switched her position because she was much more accommodating of reality than the caricature would have suggested. So this isn't an accusation specifically against her. It is an accusation against the people around her, of whom I was one. We all, I think, formed this vocabulary, and it was a very bad thing for us to have done. And if we hadn't done it, I think, and we'd been a bit braver and a bit more willing to break out of that, we probably would have avoided some of the errors that we made.
That does come across as well, that this technique that she would use of going at you hammer and tongs, and if you could defend your position on it, then she would be a lot more parsimonious after it and sort of take those things on and perhaps not give you the credit but present those ideas as her own.
Never the credit. But yes, it was always my experience that after an hour of ghastly row over some point about which I was right and she was wrong, and in which she didn't appear to be listening at all, and which she spoke from 90% of the time, a few weeks later, very often she would say exactly what I'd said without attributing it at all to me. And this was very flattering. I didn't care whether I was attributed or not. You had got through, and that was her Socratic method. That's the nicest way to put it.
One more, before we move on, one more quickly on, you have groups like the Institute of Economic Affairs, who you say one of the three planks of Thatcherism, and other groups like that, who saw her mission in the 1980s as being this sort of libertarian reforming zeal. And then a book that came out written by your mother, The Anatomy of Thatcherism, just I think after she fell, that actually talks about the vigorous virtues, that's it. And this kind of making Brits sort of stand up for themselves again and that sort of activity. And you don't think it was either of those so much as she was a problem solver, which speaks, I suppose, to that sort of pragmatic attitude. But which of the two, do you think they're useful lenses to look at the 1980s, those two sort of opposing theories? Or?
Well, there certainly was some element both of ideology and of morality about it. But yes, no, I do think she was essentially devoted to spotting problems and dealing with them, much more than to ideology.
We then fall to a point when you yourself are elected after standing in 1987, standing in 1992, and then being elected for West Dorset in 97, in a sort of, I imagine must be a lonely tranche of new Conservative MPs elected in 1997. And you talk about sitting in front of a computer when you get your room and writing down on the word processor, what is the present purpose of the Conservative Party, and staring at that blinking cursor for a long, long time. What conclusions did you come to, that the purpose of that Conservative Party up until, say, 2010, what was the purpose of it?
Well, I didn't come to any useful conclusion about this question for a long time. It puzzled me for years. And the reason, of course, was the genius of Tony Blair. It's very, very fashionable now to regard him as a failure and somebody that some people speak about him as if it's impossible to imagine why anybody ever had respect for him. He was, in point of fact, the most successful politician that we've had for